I think we are about ready now to convene the last panel of the day, which will sort of cap off some of the earlier discussions. Hopefully quite a few of you from the earlier panels, the military panel, the industry panel, are still with us. And we can tie all this together in one neat package. But as I said at lunch, we're going to hear from the dismal science and the master science, economics and politics. And we have a great lineup on today's panel. And I think we're going to go in the order in which everyone is seated here. You all have a little bio booklet that you picked up at the beginning of the day, so I'm not going to go into extensive introduction of the panelists. You can read about them. I'll just point out that I think they're all three academics of one sort or another, maybe one with a little more practice, shall we say, in Washington, D.C.
I think a lot more.
But we're going to start with my colleague, a professor of political science, author of many books, Professor Jillson, who will tell us about the politics of defense and national security and budgeting. Cal?
It's a pleasure to be here. I was not able to attend the earlier sessions. I'm sure that's my great loss. It's certainly disappointing, but I had a standing commitment with the Texas Certified Public Accountants to speak to them over lunch. So being on the budget panel is exactly the right place for me to be to finish out the day. Those people, though, take their spreadsheets much more seriously than do defense budgeters, as far as I can tell. So we'll see how all of this develops. And I am going to say as little as possible about defense budgeting, or even defense in general, and talk about politics. There are lots of people in the room that know at least as much as I do about American politics and how it has developed in recent years and likely to go from here. But I've been tapped, and so that's what I'll talk about and try to tee up the discussion for Drs. Chu and Ippolito. And I thought I would start by observing something that doesn't need to be observed at all, and that is that we are a divided nation, and that the polarization in Congress is at a modern high point. We've had other points in American history where we've been deeply polarized, but there's a big literature in political science that shows that the moderate middle that used to exist in American politics is largely gone in the Congress. People think back to the days of Eisenhower and Sam Rayburn, or even the days of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, where people could sit down from the Democratic and Republican side and talk through issues with some hope of coming to a compromise and some form of resolution. We have not had much of that in recent years, and I think our debt ceiling debate of a year or 18 months ago is the most recent example of an inability, even under very tight deadlines, to come to a meaningful resolution, and to think outside of Washington to the rest of the country. All we have to do is look at the last several electoral college maps, most recently the one of a week ago, where you see a red swath running from now just below Virginia across to Texas and up through the mid and mountain west, and the blue stretching from New England across the upper Midwest to the left coast, to see how starkly the country is divided. And think of Florida in 2000, Florida in 2012, and that does not really tee us up to resolve important issues. And lastly, I would note a re-elected Democratic president, modest Democratic gains in the Senate, but the House holding firmly for the Republicans with a majority of 40 seats or so, and you can run the House on a majority of 2 or 3. So we do continue to have divided government, which makes change difficult. And looking forward, I think change will be increasingly difficult, but things will tilt toward the Democrats. And if you look forward, I'm thinking now about the demography of the country and the discussion that is currently taking place over the vote splits among whites, which we call Anglos down here, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians in the most recent election, and how those elements of the population are likely to develop over time. And if we're going to talk forward, I think it's important also to go back, because it's easy to say, well, who knows how the politics of the country are going to develop over the next several decades. And so it's helpful to look back several decades. And I would start with the Reagan election of 1980, in which 88% of the votes cast in that election were cast by whites. And Reagan won that about 60-40, very similar to the margin that Mitt Romney enjoyed in this most recent election. But the proportion of votes cast in presidential elections by whites has come down substantially over the last 3 decades. In the 2000 election, 81% of votes cast by whites. In the 2012 election, it was 73% of votes cast by whites. So from 1980 to 2012, the white proportion of the vote goes from 88% to 73%. And what we traditionally have called minority share of the vote has gone up very substantially. In this election, it was 73% Anglos voting 60% Republican. So if you just take a second and take the 73 and make it 70 and the 60, so it's 0.6 times 0.7 is 0.42, that's 42% of the votes that you need to be elected president, a little bit more, almost 43% of the votes you need to be elected president just cast by Anglos. So the question for the Republican Party is, where do you get the next 6 or 7% of the vote? Blacks in this election voted for Obama a little bit less than they did in 2008, but still it was 93% of the black vote for Obama, 4 or 5% for Mitt Romney. That 4 or 5% for Romney is a fraction of 1% of the vote that you need to be elected president. So you look to the Hispanics, and Hispanics have traditionally voted 2-to-1 Democrat. In Texas, Governor George W. Bush and Karl Rove looked to and clearly understood that Republicans needed to take between 35 and 40% of the Hispanic vote for the Republicans to be competitive statewide into the future. And George W. Bush did easily win 35%, depending upon who you listen to. He won more than that in some elections, and that vote share of Hispanics would have sent the Republican majority in this state forward another couple of decades. But Mitt Romney lost the Hispanic vote overwhelmingly. He got something like 27% to 71% for Barack Obama. And while the Asian population is somewhat smaller, Obama got 73% of the Asian population to something like 21% for Mitt Romney. So if you go forward a couple of decades, if those vote splits remain roughly as they are, it becomes increasingly difficult for Republicans to win the popular vote, and even more difficult to win the Electoral College, because you look not only at states like Colorado and Nevada that tip this time. New Mexico has been a Democratic state for a long time, but you begin to look at Arizona, and at some point you begin to look at Texas. Jeb Bush said recently, remember Jeb is over in Florida, so he vacations here sometimes, comes to visit family, but doesn't know the state well, said that in 2016, Texas would be a purple state, maybe blue. Sorry, not even close. It is, and Leslie is going to start shedding tears here as I speak. It's going to be another 10 to 12 years before I think Democrats are competitive in Texas. So the early part of the next decade. But nationally, if you look forward, the U.S. Census has population projections that go forward to 2040. So if 1980 to 2010 is 30 years that we have in history to look at very closely going forward to 2040, in 2040, 55% of votes are likely to be cast by Anglos. If Anglos continue to cast votes at about the rate they do now and continue well, continue to cast votes at the rate they do now. They'll cast 55% of votes. Blacks will cast about 12%, same as they do today. Hispanics will cast 20%, 25% of all votes cast in the presidential election. And Asians will have moved up from 3 or 4 to 7. So the question is, what will the two parties say to the country as it develops demographically over the course of the coming decade or 2 or 3? I think the Republican challenges are greater because they start so far down among minority voters. I think the Republican Party has 2 options, and I suspect they'll take the second, but the first will be canvassed, and that is to try to win a greater share of the Anglo vote, to push it up beyond 60, to 63, 65. In Texas, 70% of the Anglo vote goes to the Republican Party. Nationally, it's 60. So it's possible that Republicans will try to be more conservative and speak to the base and try to push up their share of the Anglo vote beyond 60%. And I think that's the wrong direction, but you can't rule it out. People who make the argument that neither John McCain nor Mitt Romney were conservative enough, and that if you nominate a real conservative, that person will stand a better chance of winning the presidency, I think are not correct. Republicans can also work on fundraising, on trying to raise additional money for their candidates, because there were a number of very close elections, not just the presidential election, which was under 3%, but so many of the Senate elections turned on a percent and a half, 2, 2.5, very close. And in many states where Republicans were expected to win, states like North Dakota and Missouri and Indiana, but Republicans raised a lot of money, particularly outside. Obama outraised Romney in official fundraising narrowly, but in the super PACs, Republicans outraised Democrats, spent a lot of money. But when the two major candidates have $1 billion apiece, essentially, that extra billion of outside money, even if it leans Republican, is not enough to turn an election. So trying to win more of the Anglo vote and trying to produce larger financial advantages, I think, will not be successful. So that leaves the question of whether the problem for the Republican Party is a problem of messaging, a problem of describing current Republican policy positions in more attractive language. Immigration is the one that you hear people talk about most frequently. If we stop talking about electrifying fences and moats and building additional defenses along the border and start talking about how Republicans have always stood for lawful immigration and only oppose illegal immigration, perhaps that will help. It will help, but I think it won't be enough because currently Hispanics on a per capita basis in the United States, blacks a little bit more than this, but Hispanics on a per capita basis make about 57% of what Anglos do. On a median family income basis, Hispanics make somewhere in the high 60s of what Anglos do. So they are hard pressed and they need assistance, and the assistance that they most need are high quality public schools, because Hispanics know that the future of their children is based on access to good public schools and access to health care, insurance if possible, but access to health care. And Republicans essentially say, well, those would be very costly. We'd have to raise taxes to fund those programs, and we don't think that we can do that. Democrats say, we think we can do that. In fact, we'd be willing to raise taxes to do that. And so Hispanics' ears pick up. And I think the problem for Republicans is to find a policy stance, a substantive policy stance that is more attractive to Hispanics as they seek better incomes, as they seek to start businesses, but in the short term as they seek to find good schools for their kids and access to health care. And so I think the Republican Party will come to that. It's not just messaging, it's substance as well. Democrats also have challenges. Democrats have to rebuild bridges to the business community. They continue to be strong with the entertainment community, the high-tech community, parts of finance. They lost a lot among finance. They're not particularly well received by the defense community. I suppose we heard that earlier this morning, but again, I was not able to be here. So they have to rebuild some of those bridges. I think the Democrats will also try very hard to deliver on comprehensive immigration reform. I think Republicans have to find a way to participate in that and try to win some of the credit for it, because I do think it's going to happen. But the credit will go, I think, disproportionately to the Democratic Party rather than the Republicans, and so they'll work very hard at it. They'll also have to be very mindful of a continuing economic recovery. It's been slow and grinding to date. It has to continue at least that rate, and they hope that the economic recovery will pick up, and they and Obama will get credit for it rather than Romney having won and gotten credit for the economic recovery. So I think the more difficult problem faces the Republican Party, and the demographics are against them, which means I think that there will be continued downward pressure on defense spending. And the things that make me think that, and now I'm treading on thinner ice and I will soon give up and turn over to my colleagues, is the fact that depending upon how you count defense spending in the post-9/11 period, whether you count the base defense budget, whether you count the additional spending on Iraq and Afghanistan, and if you add in the intelligence community, the defense spending has gone up somewhere in the 70 to 100% range. Very appreciable increases in defense spending. The cost of the wars are coming down, but we have other enemies, as we heard last night, Iran and China, people talk about. I do think that it will be difficult to convince the Congress that other than repurposing current expenditures, adding to current expenditures will be a difficult sell. Because there were lots of graphs and studies that showed that in the 2008 range, U.S. defense spending, depending again upon how you count it, was the equivalent of almost all the other countries in the world combined. In the Dallas Morning News, in a UP story just on Tuesday of this week, Senator Alan Simpson, a longtime friend of the Tower Center, used the number 17 to 15, the next 17 to 15 largest defense spending nations in the world, most of whom are our allies, are spending less than the U.S. is. So given that, I think it will be relatively difficult. And the cost of some of the major systems, CVN-21, the new carrier that is coming online in the next couple decades, is somewhere in the $13 to $15 billion range, and the Joint Strike Fighter, which we hear so much about in this part of the country, has significant problems, 50% cost overruns. The numbers are going to come down. So I think it's going to be a hard sell, and I'll end on that unhappy note.
Okay, thank you, Cal. Well, the country is divided, it's polarized, not ready to make any hard choices. Is that correct, David? We're going to go to you now and let you try to straighten this all out from an economic standpoint. David Chu is the president of the Institute for Defense Analyses. David.
Well, thank you, Professor Hallfield. I appreciate being invited to join this conversation, even as representative of dismal science.
Okay.
Maybe I can ask our technical assistant to bring up the charts. I did ignore our host's plea that I not use PowerPoint, but I've lived too long inside the Beltway to get along without it. It's mostly designed to keep me organized the next few minutes. What I'd like to do is touch very briefly on three subjects this afternoon. First, venturing with great trepidation on Bob Scales' territory, which is really history, and that is, could economic issues by themselves be an important source of future conflict? Second, to what extent does the economy's size and health affect the defense posture, which is to some extent what Professor Jillson talked about? And finally, are there specific economic factors that will, in one way or another, influence the content or nature of the defense program, and vice versa? Can the defense program in some fashion have an important effect on the economy, is that something we should be worried about? To history for just a minute. I'd argue if you look over the last century or so and use it as a basis for thinking about the next 10, 20 years, that it is hard to discern any pattern in which economic issues by themselves have been the major source of conflict. Look further back, there's certainly examples of that. A good example in the China case, we've heard so much about China today, is the Opium War series, where the West, with the exception of the United States, which still earns us some goodwill in China, the West tried to change the terms of trade with China, as the Economist would phrase it, by forcing China to admit a product that its rulers didn't wish to see its people consume, because that was something the West could easily sell and cheaply transport to that trading partner. And certainly it's true at various times over the centuries, people have fought over specific resources, whether that's a warm water port, whether that's land rights, think about the Indian Wars here in North America, whether that's a region with valuable resources of one sort or another. I do subscribe to a point that was made at lunch again today, and that is that broadly speaking, it's hard to see how a world in which globalized trade plays such an important role in the prosperity of the citizens of various nations. It's hard to see nation states going to war and risking all that. The destruction of the capital stock, which is what happened in World War II. Virtually every advanced country's capital stock except the United States was destroyed, which I would argue explains a lot of the early post-World War II U.S. Prosperity. We're the last one standing, so to speak, while the others rebuilt. It's hard to see why people would risk all that in large-scale, long conflict of one sort or another. At the same time, as Bill Barnett warned us in his luncheon question, this was exactly the world position in 1914. In fact, books were written, scholarly volumes were acclaimed just before 1914 that argued war is now impossible. And so I don't think I'd completely rule it out, even if I would argue it's not a highly likely outcome. That instead, it's likely to be political or religious or historical factors, so think about the Senkakus as an example, that drive the origins of conflict. But I'll defer to Professor Scales, who's sitting far enough away that I'm probably safe from anything you can throw at me. To the larger question, as far as economists are concerned, and that is the relationship of the economy and the health of the economy specifically to the willingness of a country to spend liberally on military matters. And certainly, Admiral Mullen, his last year or two as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued this point, that the health of the nation's economy is a national security issue, and I would agree with that as a broad generalization, but I do also join General Dunn in his skepticism about making too much of that point. First of all, even in a healthy, large economy, which of course can afford a larger military establishment, resources are still finite. There are still resource trade-offs. I'm sorry Gordon Newman couldn't be here today because it was my privilege last administration to plead with Mr. England for resources for my particular lane department against all the other lanes out there. While people may say that was a period of great largesse in defense, didn't look that way from the perspective of a supplicant within the department. Still never got quite what I felt I deserved. And even if it's a large, healthy economy, there's a limit to the ability of the central government to extract resources from the citizenry and use them for military purposes. Taxes, and this is a basic economics point, taxes are a wedge. Taxes are a difference the state imposes on its citizens that changes the price of a commodity, so it costs more to buy as a consumer than it actually requires to produce. Or from the perspective of someone who renders services in the economy, you receive less than the value of the product that you originated. And people resent taxes, as we all know. Current tax policy, if I may venture on Professor Jillson's territory, mostly consists of don't tax me, tax the other fellow behind the tree. Even in World War II, when the nation's back was to the wall, and we spent on the order of 40% of the gross domestic product of the United States on military matters, even in that conflict, we could not use taxes to extract all of those resources from the economy. We had to go to other mechanisms, including rationing and command, direction, commandeering, essentially, with resources from the civil sector. And there's a bit of a conundrum here, because at the moment, as has been noted, U.S. defense spending is a relatively modest share of gross domestic product. It's on the order of 4 to 5%. That's well below the long-term big power average for the United States, which has been in the order of more like 5 to 10% if you look at the years since 1950 down to the present day. So it's hard to argue, although I accept Professor Jillson's major point, it's hard to argue that defense is the source of the deficit problem. And interestingly, both sides, at least the leadership level of President Obama, have agreed that defense is not the centerpiece of our budgetary problem. The difficulty isn't defense. Difficulty is everything else the federal government has used the federal budget to achieve. And the further difficulty, I argue, is the historical change over this last 60 years in the composition of the federal budget. If you look at the federal budget as a fraction of U.S. gross domestic product, it's, until the last 4 years, it's relatively constant, around 20% of U.S. Output of all goods and services in the United States, 20% of GDP. What's changed over a period of time is that the public goods, specifically including defense, have gone from being the major fraction of that